Behind these locked doors, the empire's most guarded secrets unfolded in whispers. Rules that controlled every glance, every touch, every night. Rules that even sultans dared not break. The harem was not a place of free desire. It was a prison of ritual where women lived and sometimes died by strange commandments of the bedchamber. From secret inspections to forbidden nights to punishments whispered but never recorded, these were the laws of intimacy inside the palace walls. Tonight, we step inside the forbidden chambers of Topkapi to uncover the strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman harem you were never meant to know. Before we open the doors, tell us in the comments from where in the world are you watching this? And subscribe to History Vault, because history isn't just power and glory, it's the secrets empires tried to erase.
Welcome to the new video. The word harem has long carried with it a sense of forbidden mystery. Western travelers of past centuries imagined it as an exotic paradise. Women draped in silks, reclining on cushions, fanned by servants, waiting for the Sultan's call. Painters from Europe filled canvases with scenes of sensual fantasy, and storytellers turned the Ottoman harem into a place of indulgence and endless pleasure. But the truth, buried beneath centuries of myth and misunderstanding, was far more complex, and in many ways, far stranger. At the heart of the Ottoman Empire, in the great palaces of Istanbul, the harem was not simply a private retreat of the Sultan. It was a fortress within a fortress. Behind its golden gates and heavy doors, more than 1,000 women could live at a time, governed by rules as rigid as those of a military barracks. The harem was a world of hierarchy, surveillance and discipline. It was both prison and palace, a place where women could rise to unimaginable power or fall into obscurity and despair. Every detail of life in the harem was regulated, including the most intimate of matters, the bedroom. For the women who lived there, nothing about love, desire, or even marriage was left to chance. Instead, strange customs, secret rituals, and harsh restrictions determined who could share a bed with the Sultan, when they could do so, and under what conditions. The origins of the harem lay deep in the traditions of Islamic and Turkic courts, long before the Ottomans rose to dominate 3 continents. In Islamic law, rulers were permitted to have multiple wives and concubines, and this privilege expanded into an institution of vast scale under the Ottomans. The harem became a symbol of imperial might. For the Sultan, it was not only a private sanctuary, but also a statement to the world that his household, like his empire, was boundless. Yet the harem was not an uncontrolled indulgence. On the contrary, it was shaped by centuries of carefully crafted regulations designed to protect dynastic stability. Every concubine who entered the harem had her life transformed into a strict routine. She was trained in manners, language, music, and etiquette. She learned obedience, silence, and secrecy. And above all, she learned that her body was not her own. It belonged to the empire. The women themselves were drawn from diverse origins. Many were slaves taken from conquered territories or purchased in markets. Others were offered as gifts by foreign dignitaries. They came from the Balkans, the Caucasus, North Africa, and beyond. Torn from their homes, they entered a new life behind walls they could not escape. For some, it was a nightmare. For others, it was a ladder to power, prestige, and riches they could never have dreamed of. At the top of the hierarchy stood the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. She ruled the harem with an authority greater than any queen in Europe, overseeing not only the concubines, but also the eunuchs, servants, and guards. Beneath her, the women of the harem were organized into ranks, from novices who performed menial tasks to favorites who had captured the Sultan's attention. Every step up the ladder required cunning, charm, and careful navigation of rivalries. But even for those who rose to the heights of favor, life was far from free. A favorite who was chosen to share the Sultan's bed was not indulging in romance. She was fulfilling a role scripted by politics and dynastic necessity. Her movements, her speech, even her emotions were subject to control. She might be dressed in the finest silks, but she remained bound by invisible chains. To understand the strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman harem, we must strip away the illusions of luxury and fantasy. These rules were not invented for pleasure. They were tools of power, forged to protect the throne from chaos. The harem was, in its own way, a political machine. The women inside it were not merely companions, but instruments of dynastic survival, and their intimacy with the Sultan was regulated with the same precision as a military campaign. Consider for a moment the tension within those walls. Hundreds of women, all with ambitions, all aware that a single night with the Sultan could change their fate forever. Yet they could not approach him freely. They could not whisper their desires or plead for his attention. Instead, they had to wait, sometimes for years, for the moment when ritual and rule opened a narrow door to the ruler's chambers. For many, that moment never came. They lived and died in the harem, their names forgotten, their stories erased, and yet, behind this system of control, there were also whispers of rebellion. Some women plotted to bend the rules, to secure a place in the Sultan's favor by means of charm, intrigue, or manipulation. Others resisted silently, refusing to give in to despair. Their struggles reveal a side of the harem that was human, not mythical. These were not faceless captives, but women of flesh and blood, each carrying her own story, her own fear, her own hope. What made the rules of the harem so strange and at times so cruel was the way they blurred the line between intimacy and politics. The act of sharing a bed was never just private. It could decide the future of dynasties, the balance of power, even the fate of empires. A child born from a concubine could one day inherit the throne, and for this reason, the rules governing the Sultan's bedroom were enforced with iron discipline. This was the paradox of the harem. To outsiders, it appeared as a place of pleasure. To those within, it was a place of duty. Every bedroom encounter was bound by rules that could seem strange, even shocking to the modern eye. Rules that dictated not only who was allowed to enter the Sultan's chamber, but how, when, and under what conditions. Rules designed to serve the empire, not the heart. And it is here within these hidden chambers of Topkapi Palace that we will uncover the secrets of those rules, the rituals, the restrictions and the unspoken codes that governed the most private moments of the most powerful man in the empire. For behind the walls of the harem, the story of intimacy was never simple. It was a battlefield, fought not with swords and shields, but with silence, patience, and strategy. And the victors were not always the strongest, but the cleverest. The strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman harem were more than curiosities of a bygone age. They reveal how power shaped even the most personal corners of life, and how those caught within the system struggled to survive and sometimes to triumph against overwhelming odds. When we imagine the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, it is easy to picture a sultan who commanded absolute authority. His word was law, his armies marched across continents, and his will shaped the destiny of millions. Yet even in the most private realm, his own bedroom, the sultan's choices were far from free. Behind the gilded curtains of the harem, desire did not decide who entered the ruler's bed. Protocol did. One of the strangest rules of the Ottoman harem was that the sultan could not simply summon any woman he pleased at any time. His intimate life was overseen, filtered, and controlled by a network of officials and guardians who ensured that even the most private encounter served the interests of the dynasty. To the modern mind, it seems extraordinary that the ruler of an empire stretching from Hungary to Arabia could not act on impulse in his own chambers. But this restriction was deliberate, designed to protect the stability of the throne. The first layer of control came from the eunuchs, men who had been castrated, entrusted with guarding the harem's secrets. Chief among them was the Kızlar Asa, the black eunuch, one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman court. He controlled the gates of the harem and monitored every movement within it. Even the Sultan himself relied on this official to arrange his private affairs. A concubine did not simply wander into the ruler's chambers. She was presented, selected, and approved. Then came the authority of the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. Her influence stretched deep into the Sultan's private life. She had a vested interest in controlling who shared his bed, for the women chosen had the potential to bear heirs, heirs who could threaten her own lineage or strengthen it. With quiet authority, the Valide Sultan often decided which concubines rose to the rank of Haseki, the official favorites, and which remained nameless attendants. In some reigns, the mother of the Sultan wielded more power than the wives and concubines themselves, ensuring that her approval shaped the future of the dynasty. It was in this web of oversight that one of the strangest bedroom customs emerged, the ceremony of the Sultan as nightly selection. The process, sometimes whispered about by chroniclers, was far from spontaneous. On designated evenings, a group of women would be assembled, adorned in their finest silks and jewels, prepared for inspection. The Sultan could indicate his choice, but even then, tradition and etiquette dictated the manner of the encounter. The chosen woman was bathed, perfumed, and dressed in garments chosen by attendants. She was escorted through guarded corridors, not in secrecy, but under the watchful eyes of officials, as if every step were part of a ritual. She was expected to greet the Sultan with rehearsed gestures of deference, her words measured, her gaze controlled. The meeting between ruler and concubine was not framed as an act of passion, but as a carefully managed duty. Perhaps the strangest part of this custom was what followed. If the woman conceived a child, her fate changed dramatically. By the rule of the harem, a concubine who bore a son to the Sultan was never allowed to share his bed again. This might sound like punishment, but it was in fact part of the empire's logic of survival. Once a woman became the mother of a potential heir, her role shifted from lover to guardian of her child's future. To allow her continued intimacy with the Sultan might give her too much influence, too much power. Thus she was elevated to a new rank, but also permanently distanced from the ruler's private chambers. The Ottomans believed this rule prevented the dominance of any single woman over the Sultan. It was a safeguard against favoritism, a way to keep the balance of the harem intact. Yet for the women themselves, it could feel like a cruel twist of fate. A single night of intimacy might bring unimaginable fortune, or it might consign them to years of isolation, living out their days in guarded luxury, watching rivals take the place they once held. This system produced winners and losers, and it was no less cutthroat than the political intrigues outside the harem's walls. Some women schemed desperately for the chance to be chosen, whispering their charms into the ears of eunuchs, bribing attendants, or even poisoning rivals. Others feared selection, knowing that life in the Sultan's bed was not always a blessing. The risk of childbirth, the pressure of scrutiny, and the constant presence of rivals made the role as perilous as it was prestigious. What is striking about this arrangement is how thoroughly it subordinated personal intimacy to political necessity. For the Sultan, the bedroom was not a place of escape, but another battlefield, where alliances were forged not with treaties, but with embraces, and where strategy decided who would cross the threshold of his chamber. The empire's survival depended, in part, on how well these strange bedroom rules contained desire, controlled reproduction, and ensured loyalty. Western travelers who caught rumors of these customs often reacted with disbelief. They saw only the surface, silk robes, perfumed baths, women competing for favor, and dismissed it as decadence. But for the Ottomans, this ritualized control was not decadence at all. It was discipline, woven into the very fabric of dynastic rule. It was a system that ensured no single woman could monopolize the Sultan's affection, and that every child born within the palace fit into the careful calculations of succession. And so, behind the shimmering curtains of the harem, the Sultan's choice was never truly his own. He was a ruler encircled not only by armies and advisors, but by rules that shaped his most private life. To outsiders, it looked strange. To those within, it was survival. These strange customs remind us that even in the most personal moments, power was never absent. The harem was not about romance, it was about empire. Every night, every embrace, every child born within those walls was entangled in a web of control. But if the Sultan himself was bound by rules, what of the women who served within the harem? They too lived under strange bedroom laws that dictated their futures in ways both curious and cruel. Some rules elevated them to power, others condemned them to lives of silence. And in the next part of our journey, we will uncover how these women were prepared, watched, and even tested before they could ever hope to be chosen for the Sultan's bed. The harem was not a place where women simply lounged in silken robes waiting to be chosen. It was an institution, carefully designed to mold ordinary girls into instruments of dynastic survival. Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, concubines underwent a transformation that was part education, part indoctrination, and part silent preparation for the possibility of intimacy with the Sultan. The strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman Harem began long before a woman ever set foot in the ruler's chamber. They began the day she was brought inside. Most of the women who filled the harem were not born into luxury. They came from the far reaches of the empire, or even beyond its borders. Captives from the Caucasus, the Balkans, or Circassia, purchased in markets or given as tribute. A girl who entered these gates might be no more than 12 or 13 years old, bewildered, frightened, and suddenly caught in a world of foreign customs. The first rule she encountered was simple. Her past was erased. Names were often stripped away and replaced with new ones, chosen to suit the palace. A childhood identity vanished, replaced by a carefully curated persona that fit the empire's needs. Then came the long process of training. To live in the harem was to be constantly observed, judged not only by what one did, but how one moved, how one spoke, how one carried oneself. Girls were taught languages, music, poetry, and calligraphy, not for their own enrichment, but to make them pleasing companions. They learned the subtle art of walking gracefully, of bowing with elegance, of lowering their eyes at the precise moment. Even laughter was practiced, measured to never be too loud or too frivolous. Among these lessons were the rules of intimacy, whispered behind closed doors, passed down from older women to younger ones. A concubine might be drilled in how to approach the Sultan, how to stand before him, how to respond when summoned. She was trained in the rituals of bathing, perfuming, and dressing that preceded every encounter, as though intimacy itself were a performance on a stage, and the audience was not the Sultan alone, but the entire empire watching through the veil of custom. What makes this system particularly strange to modernize is the degree to which the women's bodies were regulated. They were not left to their own devices. They were inspected for health, groomed to perfection, and sometimes even tested for obedience. Older attendants, known as kalfas, would watch their behavior, report on their progress, and quietly determine whether a girl was fit to be presented to the ruler. Those who failed in discipline were relegated to lesser roles, perhaps serving the higher-ranking concubines or spending their lives in menial tasks within the palace. For those who showed promise, the rules became stricter. They were not simply companions in waiting, they were potential bearers of dynastic blood. As such, their chastity was guarded with fanatical intensity. Eunuchs patrolled every passageway, every courtyard, ensuring that no man but the Sultan could ever lay eyes on them in an intimate way. To break this rule was unthinkable, punishable by death for both parties. Desire was not theirs to claim. It belonged to the state. This created a peculiar paradox. These women were trained in beauty, charm, and seduction, yet forbidden to use it freely. Their allure was crafted not for themselves, not even for their own happiness, but for one man alone and only when custom allowed. Until then, they lived in a strange half-world, where every smile, every gesture, every glance was rehearsed but never truly enacted. The strangest of all was the way the harem turned preparation itself into a ritual. When a woman was finally considered ready to meet the Sultan, she did not simply appear before him. Her body was bathed by attendants, her skin perfumed with rare oils, her hair braided with jewels. She was dressed in robes chosen not by herself but by officials, and she was taught to approach with a choreography of steps, as though the act of walking into a room was part of a sacred script. And yet, many of these women never reached that stage. The majority of concubines lived their lives within the harem without ever once being chosen for the Sultan's bed. For them, the strange rules were a kind of lifelong rehearsal for a role they would never play. They became musicians, dancers, or caretakers of the younger girls, their talents redirected into the service of the palace, while a select few advanced toward the coveted and dangerous position of consort. Imagine the psychological weight of such a life, to spend years learning how to please, to rehearse every motion, to submit to endless observation, all without knowing if you would ever be summoned. For some, the dream of being chosen was a glittering prize, the only path to influence and fortune. For others, it was a terror. They had seen how swiftly the favor of the Sultan could turn, how rivals whispered poison into the ears of eunuchs, how a single mistake could mean exile or worse. This, too, was part of the strange rules. Intimacy was never simply about passion. It was about survival. A woman who entered the Sultan's chamber risked not only her body, but her future. If she pleased him, she might rise to the rank of Haseki, wielding influence greater than any minister. If she bore a son, she might secure wealth and status for life. But if she displeased him, her fate could be obscurity, dismissal, or worse, being sent away to a provincial palace forgotten in a gilded cage. The harem's rules of training and testing remind us of something essential. That desire was not private here. It was public, political, and deeply controlled. A young girl's life could be consumed by the hope of a single night, and that night itself was bound by laws she did not make. And so the harem shaped its women into instruments of dynasty, their every movement rehearsed, their every desire muted. It was a world where even intimacy was scripted, where every touch, every word, every glance was monitored by a system larger than themselves. In this strange, elaborate theater, the women of the harem learned that love was not their own, and intimacy was never free. But what happened when these carefully trained women finally entered the Sultan's chambers? What rules governed that private world, where power and desire met behind closed doors? In the next section, we will step into that forbidden chamber and uncover the bizarre protocols that shaped the most intimate moments of the Ottoman court. If the harem was a grand theater of rehearsals, then the Sultan's private chamber was the final stage, the place where all the training, the whispers, and the preparation converged. But contrary to the fantasies that later Western travelers painted, this was not a place of unrestrained indulgence. The Ottoman ruler's bedroom was bound by rules as intricate as the empire's laws, and as rigid as the marble walls that enclosed the palace. The first and most important rule was this: the Sultan alone decided when and with whom intimacy would occur. A concubine could not request an audience, nor suggest herself. Even the women who longed for his attention, who prayed for the chance to secure their position through intimacy, could do nothing but wait. The summons came not from him directly, but through the chief black eunuch, who served as both gatekeeper and messenger. When his word was spoken, it carried the weight of destiny. The chosen concubine was not free to prepare herself as she wished. Every step was ritualized. She would be bathed by attendants, perfumed with ambergris or rose water, and dressed in robes selected by the senior women of the harem. Jewels would glimmer in her hair, but her face would remain natural, untouched by cosmetics. This was another curious rule. Artificial embellishment was discouraged. The Sultan was expected to see the woman as she truly was, not hidden behind powders or paints. But even in this moment of preparation, the element of control was absolute. The concubine did not walk to the chamber on her own. She was escorted silently by eunuchs through dimly lit corridors. The palace itself seemed to enforce secrecy. Torches flickered, footsteps echoed, but voices were hushed. It was as though the entire world held its breath when the Sultan called for a companion. Once she entered his private quarters, yet another rule came into effect. She was never to look at him directly until he gave permission. To raise her eyes unbidden was seen as arrogance, perhaps even as an act of defiance. Instead, she stood with her gaze lowered, waiting until the Sultan acknowledged her presence. Only then could the encounter truly begin. And it was not simply an encounter of bodies. The rules demanded conversation, music, and poetry. Many concubines had been trained not just in beauty but in wit and charm. A night with the Sultan was as much about companionship as it was about desire. The ruler of the empire sought not merely a lover, but a confidant, someone who could entertain his mind as well as please his senses. But even here, pleasure was not always the goal. The harem existed above all for dynastic continuity. One of the strangest rules of the Ottoman bedroom was the management of fertility. Concubines who shared the Sultan's bed were not merely partners, they were potential mothers of princes. As such, every intimate encounter was shadowed by politics. No concubine could share his bed more than once unless she conceived a child. This custom, though it varied through different reigns, ensured that no single woman could monopolize the Sultan's affections without producing an heir. It was a way to balance the power within the harem, to prevent jealousy from exploding into factional rivalries. For the women, this meant that intimacy was not only rare but enormously consequential. A single night could change the course of their entire lives. If a concubine did bear a son, she rose to the exalted rank of Haseki Sultan. Her influence expanded overnight, and she could wield real power within the palace. But there was another side to this rule. Those who failed to conceive might never be summoned again. For them, the night could be both the pinnacle of their existence and the abrupt end of their hopes. The rules also extended to the physical environment. The Sultan's bedchamber was designed for both intimacy and majesty. Draped in silks, perfumed with incense, the room reflected not merely desire but sovereignty. Every detail reminded the woman that she was not with an ordinary man, but with the embodiment of empire. Even the lighting was regulated. Candles or lanterns were arranged so that shadows played across the chamber, casting the Sultan in a kind of sacred aura. One particularly curious custom was the prohibition against staying overnight. Unless she conceived, a concubine was often dismissed before dawn, escorted back to the harem by eunuchs. The night was fleeting, controlled, and never hers to claim. The Sultan retained the privilege of dismissing her at will, leaving her future hanging in uncertainty. This strict choreography reveals something striking. The Ottoman Harem was less about indulgence than about order. Every embrace, every whisper, every kiss was framed within a system designed to protect dynastic power. Far from being a paradise of pleasure, it was a place where even intimacy was a political act. Yet the women were not without agency. Many learned to use these rules to their advantage. A concubine who charmed the Sultan with her conversation, who displayed wit or intelligence in addition to beauty, might secure his favor more effectively than one who relied on appearance alone. Others aligned themselves with powerful allies within the harem, the Valid Sultan, the mother of the ruler, whose influence often outweighed that of any concubine. Navigating the rules became a form of strategy, as dangerous and delicate as any battle fought on the empire's frontiers. To modernize, the strangeness of these bedroom rules lies not in their exoticism, but in their precision. Love was reduced to law, desire to ritual, intimacy to protocol. The women who stepped into the Sultan's chamber entered not just a bedroom, but a world where every action was measured, every word carried weight, and every outcome could decide the balance of power within the empire. For the Sultan himself, these rules were equally binding. His nights were not his own, but extensions of his reign. His choice of companion could spark rivalries, ignite jealousies, and even influence the course of succession. What seems at first like the most private of moments was in truth a public act, scrutinized and remembered by the countless eyes and ears of the palace. And so, behind the gilded doors of Topkapi, intimacy became a performance, bound by custom, guided by ritual and haunted by politics. The Sultan's chamber was never a place of simple pleasure. It was a crucible where power, fate, and desire collided. But as rigid as these rules were, they did not eliminate conflict. In fact, they often intensified it. For every woman who rose through intimacy, there were rivals who plotted her downfall. Behind the silks and perfumes lurked whispers, intrigues, and betrayals. The harem was not only a place of strange rules, but of dangerous games that could make or unmake queens and determine the future of the empire itself. The harem may have seemed like a palace of luxury, but beneath its marble halls and golden domes, it was a battlefield. Not of swords and cannons, but of whispers, glances, and calculated moves. For the women who lived within its walls, survival depended on navigating not only the rigid bedroom rules of the Sultan, but also the dangerous rivalries those rules created. At the heart of this system was scarcity. Each woman, no matter how beautiful, no matter how gifted, knew that her chance to enter the Sultan's chamber might come only once, or never at all. That knowledge sharpened ambition into a weapon. The concubine chosen for a night could return as a rising star, perhaps even the mother of a prince. But for every woman who rose, dozens were left in the shadows, their hopes burning with resentment. Jealousy became the invisible currency of the harem. It lurked in the corridors, in the baths, in the dormitories where hundreds of women slept side by side. Rivalries were not shouted in open conflict, but whispered behind veils. A careless word, a misplaced rumor could destroy a rival's chances before she ever stepped into the Sultan's sight. One of the strangest bedroom rules, limiting a concubine to a single night unless she conceived, fueled this atmosphere of suspicion. A woman who returned from the Sultan's chamber pregnant was not merely blessed with a child. She became a figure of immense influence. The others knew that her son might one day be a prince, even a sultan. With that knowledge came both reverence and hatred. Some concubines who bore sons became untouchable, guarded by eunuchs and protected by the Valide Sultan herself. Others, however, became targets. Whispers of infertility, questions about legitimacy, or even subtle attempts to harm a child were not unknown. The consequences of jealousy were not limited to whispers. There are stories, whether truth or rumor, of poisoned cups of sherbet, of silken bowstrings used not only on rebellious viziers, but on women who stood in the way of another's rise. In the harem, intimacy could secure power, but it could just as easily invite death. The eunuchs too played their part in these rivalries. As the gatekeepers of the Sultan's chamber, their favor was coveted. A word from the chief black eunuch could mean the difference between obscurity and triumph. Many women sought to win their support through gifts, promises, or alliances. But this too created tension. Those who suspected a rival of currying favor might spread rumors of corruption or deceit, hoping to tarnish her standing before she was summoned. And then there was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Her role in this web of rivalries cannot be overstated. As the most powerful woman in the empire, she often decided which concubines would be presented to her son. The strange bedroom rules, therefore, were not enforced in isolation. They were manipulated by the very women who lived by them. A concubine who earned the Valide's trust might rise quickly, while one who crossed her could find herself banished to obscurity. Yet for all the ruthlessness, survival in the harem required more than beauty or intrigue. It required patience, intelligence, and an almost uncanny ability to read the shifting currents of palace politics. Many concubines who thrived were those who played the long game, waiting quietly until opportunity presented itself, then seizing it without hesitation. The consequences of breaking the bedroom rules were severe. A concubine who attempted to approach the Sultan without summons, or who lingered too long after dawn, could be punished harshly. Sometimes this meant banishment to the old palace, a place where forgotten women lived out their days in silence. Others disappeared more mysteriously, their names struck from the records, their fates whispered about only in hushed tones. Even the sultans themselves were not free from the dangers these rivalries created. A choice of companion could spark unrest within the harem, creating factions that rippled outward into the politics of the empire. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, for example, his deep attachment to Hurrem Sultan, once a concubine, shattered centuries of tradition and provoked bitter rivalries. Her rise to become his legal wife changed the balance of power within the harem forever, but it also unleashed jealousy that smoldered for years. For the women who lived inside these walls, every rule became both a boundary and a weapon. The prohibition on multiple nights with the Sultan meant that one woman's fleeting opportunity could never be repeated unless she produced an heir. That knowledge drove some to desperation. Accounts exist of women who prayed feverishly, who sought charms or potions, hoping to conceive after a single encounter. Others lived in quiet despair, knowing that their moment had passed forever. In many ways, the bedroom rules transformed intimacy into a contest of survival. It was not about love or even desire, but about securing a future. For the concubines, the stakes were as high as on any battlefield. To fail meant obscurity. To succeed meant influence, power, and perhaps immortality through the line of a son who might one day sit upon the throne. Yet the cruelest irony of all was this: even success could bring peril. A woman who bore a son entered a new and dangerous game. Ottoman law forbade multiple heirs from ruling simultaneously, and succession often ended in fratricide. The very child who secured a concubine's future could also doom her to watch her son fall victim to a brother's ambition. In such a system, a mother's greatest joy was shadowed by her deepest fear. This was the hidden cost of the harem's strange bedroom rules. What to outsiders might have seemed like luxury and indulgence was, for the women within, a life of constant vigilance. Every glance, every whisper, every summons to the Sultan's chamber carried with it the weight of survival. And so the harem was not a paradise of pleasure, but a labyrinth of jealousy, rivalry, and danger. It was a world where intimacy was never truly private, where love was tangled with ambition, and where breaking a single rule could mean the end of everything. The harem was never merely about desire. For centuries, it stood at the heart of the Ottoman Empire's power structure, a place where private lives became public politics and where intimate rules shaped the destiny of nations. But what was left behind, after generations of whispered orders and veiled intrigues, were stories that remind us of the high cost of control. The bedroom rules may seem strange, even absurd to modern eyes. A single night of intimacy, a lifetime of consequences, a network of women whose fate depended on whether a child was conceived behind closed doors. Yet, within the empire, these rules were seen as essential. They kept the harem orderly, prevented jealousies from spilling into outright chaos, and gave the Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, control over the future of the dynasty. What seemed like domestic ritual was, in truth, a form of governance. But while these rules served the empire's needs, for the women they often meant a lifetime of uncertainty. One could rise overnight from obscurity to influence, but just as quickly be banished to the old palace, where the forgotten concubines of previous reigns lived out their days in quiet exile. It was a world where the boundaries of freedom were defined not by the walls of Topkapi Palace, but by the rules of the bedchamber itself. Consider the irony. The empire that once ruled across 3 continents, feared and admired by Europe and Asia alike, had its greatest political battles fought not only on the battlefield, but in the hush of silk-draped chambers. The harem, with its rituals and restrictions, was more than a domestic space. It was a crucible where ambition, fear, and survival were tested. For every sultan who emerged as a strong ruler, there were concubines and mothers whose choices, shaped by these strange rules, guided him long before he sat upon the throne. And yet, the stories of these women have often been dismissed as scandal, reduced to fantasies of indulgence or Orientalist exaggerations. In truth, their lives were defined by a system that left little room for choice. They were, in many cases, enslaved or taken from their homelands, then reshaped into instruments of imperial policy. The rules of the bedroom were not about pleasure, they were about control. They ensured that no woman, however beloved, could ever dominate the Sultan entirely, unless she played the political game with unrivaled skill. Hürrem Sultan, once a concubine of unknown origin, proved that it was possible to bend those rules to her advantage. She secured not just knights with Suleiman the Magnificent, but marriage, power, and a legacy that reshaped the empire. But for every Hürrem, there were countless others whose names are lost to history. Women who passed quietly into obscurity, their lives governed by rules they could never change. These strange bedroom rules reveal something deeper about power itself. They remind us that empires are not only built on armies and conquests, but also on the invisible structures that regulate daily life. The fate of princes, the succession of sultans, even the stability of the empire, all were influenced by the choices made behind closed doors under the strict gaze of ritual. And so, when we peel back the curtain of the Ottoman Harem, we find not a world of exotic fantasy, but a story of human ambition, jealousy, and survival. A story where the most private acts carried the weight of empire, and where women, often voiceless in the official histories, shaped the course of nations through the most intimate of rules. The legacy of the harem is complicated. For some, it remains a symbol of oppression, a reminder of how women were confined and controlled. For others, it stands as a testament to the resilience and intelligence of the women who learned to wield influence within its walls. But whether viewed as cage or court, its strange bedroom rules continue to fascinate us centuries later, because they reveal the uncomfortable truth about history. That power is never just about armies and crowns, it is also about control over the human body and the choices it can or cannot make. As we close this journey into the secret world of the Ottoman Harem, we are left with haunting questions. How many lives were shaped, even destroyed, by a single night in the Sultan's chamber? How many ambitions were crushed by rules written not in law books, but in whispers and traditions? And how many stories remain untold, hidden within the silences of history? What we can say with certainty is this: the Ottoman harem was never the paradise of pleasure outsiders imagined. It was a system of rules, rituals, and restrictions that turned intimacy into politics and survival into a nightly gamble. The strange bedroom rules remind us that history is not just about kings and conquests, but about the unseen battles fought in the most unexpected of places. And that is why we study them, not to glorify, not to sensationalize, but to understand the truth. To remember the women who lived and died under these rules, and to recognize how their hidden struggles shaped the empire itself. So, as the marble corridors of Topkapi fade into the dust of history, we leave you with this thought: empires may rise and fall, but the human desire for power, survival, and freedom remains the same. If you've been captivated by the untold stories of the Ottoman harem, don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to History Vault for more deep dives into the hidden, the forgotten, and the forbidden chapters of history. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and share it with others who think history is far more than glory. It is also the shadows that empires tried to conceal. And before you go, tell us in the comments, from where in the world are you watching today? We can't wait to hear your voices as we uncover the voices history tried to silence.